Hi everyone. My name is Claire Harmon. I'm 31 years old. I live in Nashville, Tennessee, and I want to start by saying I am not a dramatic person. I have never in my life posted anything personal online. I don't air my laundry on Facebook. I don't subtweet. I don't send passive-aggressive texts to family group chats. I am by almost every measure the kind of woman who keeps her head down, works hard, smiles at the dinner table even when her jaw is aching from the effort, and convinces herself that if she's just patient enough, things will eventually be fair. I believed that for 31 years, and then my sister grabbed the microphone at my wedding reception in front of 147 guests and announced that she was pregnant. That was 4 months ago. And if that were the whole story, I might have just cried about it, forgiven her at Christmas, and let it quietly fester for the rest of my life the way I've let everything else quietly fester. But that's not the whole story. Because 2 weeks after my wedding, I found out who the father of that baby actually was. And when I tell you that what I did next was the most terrifying, most satisfying, most necessary thing I have ever done in my entire life, I need you to understand that I did not do it out of anger. I did it because I finally stopped believing that staying quiet was the same thing as being good. So let me take you back to the beginning. Because you need to understand Danielle before you can understand any of this. Danielle is my younger sister. She's 28. She's 5'4". She has the kind of effortless blonde hair that makes strangers stop her in parking lots. And she has been, for as long as I can remember, the sun that our entire family orbits around. I don't say that with bitterness. I say it the way you say a fact about the weather. It just was. It just always was. My parents, Karen and Jim Harmon, are good people. I want to make that clear. They're not monsters. They didn't sit down when we were children and decide to love one daughter more than the other. But there is a particular kind of parental blindness that forms when one child is louder, flashier, more emotionally demanding, and the other child is quiet, capable, contained. Danielle cried. They came running. Danielle needed. They provided. Danielle dreamed out loud. They funded the dream. My parents paid for 2 years of Danielle's acting classes. A semester of culinary school, she quit in 6 weeks, a cross-country road trip she took at 22 with 3 friends and her parents' credit card, and a down payment on a condo she eventually lost because she stopped paying the HOA fees. I paid for my own college, took out loans, worked 2 jobs, one at a campus coffee shop, one as a data entry assistant for a property management company, graduated with a degree in marketing, moved to Nashville, got a job at a mid-sized firm called Aldrich & Vance, and spent 6 years slowly, quietly, steadily building a life. Nobody threw me a party for any of that. And I told myself that was fine. That I didn't need the applause, that doing the right thing was its own reward. But if I'm honest, and I'm trying to be, here in a way I haven't been able to be with myself for a long time, it wasn't fine. It was just something I'd accepted as the cost of being the steady one, the reliable one, the one who didn't make things difficult. And then I met Marcus. Marcus Webb came into my life at a birthday party I almost didn't go to. My coworker Jana dragged me to this rooftop bar downtown on a Thursday night, and I was already planning my exit before I even got there. I had a presentation the next morning. I was tired. I wasn't in the mood to make small talk with strangers while pretending the music wasn't too loud. But Marcus was standing near the door when I walked in, holding a drink he clearly wasn't enjoying, looking just as uncomfortable as I felt, and I don't know why. But I laughed, just laughed. And he looked over and he laughed too, and we spent the next 3 hours in the quietest corner of that rooftop talking about everything. He was an architect. He was from Georgia originally. He hated olives and loved bad action movies, and had once cried at a dog food commercial and was deeply embarrassed about it. He was kind. He was thoughtful. He called when he said he would call. We dated for 2 years before he proposed. He got down on one knee in my living room, with no audience, no cameras, no grand gesture, just the 2 of us and a ring his grandmother had left him, and a speech that made me cover my face with both hands because I couldn't let him see me cry that hard. I said yes before he finished the sentence. I called my mother that night to tell her. She screamed, the good kind. The kind that actually means joy. She kept saying finally, "Oh finally, you deserve this so much, Claire," and I want to sit with how that made me feel for a second. Because my mother saying "you deserve this" was not a common occurrence. My mother wasn't stingy with love, but the specific targeted kind of enthusiasm she brought to my engagement, It felt new. Like she was making up for a deficit she'd only just noticed. And I took it. Because I was happy, and I was in love, and I was 30 years old and getting married, and I didn't want to audit my mother's sincerity in that moment. I just wanted to feel it. Danielle called the next morning. She'd clearly heard from my mom the night before, which typical, but anyway. She called and she was warm and lovely, and said, "I'm so happy for you, Claire. Marcus is honestly perfect for you, like honestly exactly what you deserve." And I thanked her. And we talked for almost an hour, which was longer than we'd talked on the phone in probably 2 years. It felt like a door opening. The kind of door you've been standing near for a long time without quite being able to push through. We planned a wedding for 14 months. I did most of it myself. The venue, the flowers, the caterer, the playlist. I chose a venue outside Nashville. This beautiful old farm property, with a white barn and string lights and a field of wildflowers that would be in full bloom in June. I made a budget and stuck to it. I addressed my own invitations by hand. I hand-sewed a sash onto my veil because the alterations shop wanted $400 to do it, and I have a YouTube tutorial addiction. My mother helped, genuinely. She came to dress appointments, she tasted cakes with me. She cried in a very genuine way when she saw me in the gown. I want to give her that credit. My sister Danielle was my maid of honor. Looking back, I know what you're thinking. And yes, I know. But she's my sister. Whatever complicated history we had, whatever uneven ground we'd always stood on, she's my sister. I asked her because I couldn't imagine standing at the front of a room that important without her beside me. She accepted with this enormous hug, and a very theatrical "Oh my God, Claire, of course I would die for you," that my mother photographed. And for a while things were actually good. She came to the engagement party. She showed up to the bridal shower. She texted me about bridesmaid dresses with real enthusiasm. She even got along with Marcus, which had not always been a guarantee. Danielle had a habit of deciding she didn't like the partners of people close to her, usually around the time those partners stopped finding her, quite as enchanting as she expected everyone to find her. I started to think, maybe this is it. Maybe this is the moment things shift between us. Maybe a wedding is the thing that finally makes us equals. I was so stupid. Danielle, at this point, had been married for about 18 months to a man named Brett Calloway. Brett was a nice enough guy, mild-mannered, a little passive, the kind of man who laughed at all of Danielle's jokes, even the ones that weren't funny. He worked in insurance. He adored her, which I think was the primary thing Danielle looked for in a partner. They'd had a quick engagement, a big wedding. My parents contributed significantly to that wedding, which I noted and said nothing about, and moved into a rental house in the suburb of Nashville where my parents live. Convenient for everyone, I thought. Especially Danielle, who still had Sunday dinners at my parents' house almost every week and called my mother more times in a day than most people text. I lived 20 minutes away and saw my parents maybe once a month. Anyway, about 6 weeks before my wedding, Danielle and I had lunch. Just the two of us. It was nice. She was asking about centerpieces and the rehearsal dinner schedule, seemed genuinely interested, was funny and warm in the way she could occasionally be when she wasn't performing for anyone. I left that lunch thinking, okay, this is going to be okay. This is going to be a good day. And if you've ever dealt with a family member like Danielle, you already know that warmth is not a signal that things are fine. That warmth is the calm before June 14th. The most beautiful day of my life, and also the day it was taken from me. I got ready that morning in the farmhouse's bridal suite, which was a converted loft above the barn, exposed beams, white curtains, mason jars with wildflowers on every surface. Jana and my other two bridesmaids were there, and my mother, and a photographer named Reese who moved so quietly through the room that sometimes you forgot she was there. The morning was exactly what I'd dreamed it would be. Champagne at 10 a.m. Somebody put a playlist on the Bluetooth speaker. Soft, acoustic versions of songs I love. And for 3 hours I sat in a chair while a makeup artist worked on my face, and my mother held my hand, and said almost nothing, which was the best thing she could have done, and I felt utterly, completely, peacefully myself. Danielle arrived about 40 minutes before the ceremony. She came in with energy, that's the only way to put it. She swept into the room and immediately the center of gravity shifted toward her. She hugged everyone with the particular ferocity of someone who wants it noted how affectionate they are. She said the flowers were gorgeous, said the space was so clear, which she meant as a compliment but which lands differently depending on your history. She looked beautiful in her bridesmaid dress, which I knew she would. She also had her hair done differently than we'd discussed at the trial run. She'd asked for loose waves to coordinate with the other bridesmaids, and instead she had this updo that I can only describe as deliberately bridal. Not my style, just more formal, more elevated. The kind of hair you wear when you want to be noticed. I noticed. I said nothing. My mother said, "Oh Danny, your hair is gorgeous." I looked at my reflection in the long mirror propped against the wall. My dress was simple. Silk charmeuse, a low back. No embellishment except the sash I'd sewn on myself. My hair was down. I looked like a bride. Danielle looked like a woman who had gotten dressed for a different occasion and stumbled into someone else's wedding. I took a breath. I told myself, this is your day. You choose what this day means. She cannot take that from you. I told myself that several more times over the next hour. The ceremony was perfect. I need you to know that, because the rest of this is so painful. The ceremony was genuinely breathtakingly perfect. Marcus cried when I walked down the aisle. My father held my arm and whispered, "I'm so proud of you, Cleary," and I had to stare straight ahead at the string lights to keep myself together. Our officiant, Marcus's college roommate, gave a speech that made half the room laugh and the other half reach for their napkins. We said our vows. We kissed. We walked back down the aisle to a song Marcus had picked that I hadn't heard until that exact moment, and I want you to understand, it was the most cherished, most seen, most loved I have ever felt in my life. That moment lasted about 4 hours. Then we sat down to dinner. Then the speeches began. I want to describe for you what that dinner felt like before Danielle stood up, because I think it matters. I think you need to understand what was in the room before she took it. Marcus and I were seated at the sweetheart table, which was up on a small platform overlooking the rest of the reception space. I could see everyone, our college friends and his architecture colleagues and my parents and Danielle and Brett at the head family table, and Marcus's cousins who had driven from Georgia, and his aunt who kept wiping her eyes with the corner of her napkin. The light in that barn was amber and warm from the string lights overhead and the candles on every table. Someone was already dancing, even before the official first dance, a couple near the back who just couldn't help themselves. The food was good. This local caterer I'd researched for 3 months. There was a live acoustic duo in the corner playing jazz versions of pop songs. Everything smelled like flowers, and summer, and barbecue. And it was everything. It was absolutely everything. I had the thought, sitting there with Marcus's hand covering mine on the table, this is the happiest I have ever been. I should say it out loud. I should make sure I actually say it so I remember it, so it becomes one of those marked moments that I can return to later in my life when I need to remember what happiness feels like. I leaned over and said it quietly to Marcus. I'm the happiest I've ever been right now. He looked at me. He said, "Me too." And then the first speaker stood up. My father went first, then Marcus's mother. Then Jana, my coworker and one of my bridesmaids, gave a short, sweet, genuinely funny speech that got a great response. Then it was Danielle's turn. Danielle stood up. She was wearing the dusty rose bridesmaid dress I'd chosen. She'd complained mildly about the color, but ultimately said nothing, and she'd done something with her hair that made it look more bridal than mine. I noticed that. I noticed it and filed it away under the things I was not going to let ruin this day. She tapped the microphone. The room went quiet. She started talking about me, about us, about growing up together. She said some genuinely sweet things. She mentioned the time I helped her study for her driving test, the time she was 14 and heartbroken over a boy, and I stayed up until 2 a.m., letting her cry into my shoulder. I felt my chest open up. I thought, she loves me. She really does. We're going to be okay. Then she paused. She pressed her hand flat against her stomach, and she said, I also have some news of my own tonight. Brett and I were expecting. The room erupted. I want to be precise about the order of things that happened in my body in that moment. First, a sharp cold thing in my chest. Then a roaring in my ears. Then the sensation of every face in that room swiveling toward her. Every single face. The cameras, the phones raised for photos, the turned shoulders, the gasps of delight, all of it flooding toward Danielle, who was standing there with her hand on her stomach, and her eyes bright, and this smile that I recognized, even in my shock, as the smile she uses when she has gotten exactly what she came for. Marcus found my hand under the table. He squeezed it hard. I know he squeezed it hard because I felt it in my knuckle bones, but my face had gone completely still. My mother. My mother burst into tears, not the gentle dabbing kind she'd been doing all day at the ceremony. These were big, overwhelmed sobs. She stood up from her seat and crossed the room and wrapped Danielle in a hug that lasted long enough for at least 6 people to photograph it. The toasts were over. I watched my wedding become my sister's pregnancy announcement. I did not cry that night. I held it together through the rest of dinner, through the cake cutting, through the first dance, through the final hour of music and goodbye hugs and birdseed thrown in the parking lot. I hugged my sister. I said congratulations in a voice I do not know how I produced. She hugged me back with both arms, hard, and said, "I'm so happy for you, Claire. This whole day was so beautiful, and I felt I can only describe it as vertigo. Like the ground I was standing on had been replaced with something that looked exactly like solid ground but wasn't." My mother cried again while hugging me goodbye. She held my face in both hands and said, "You were so beautiful today. We love you so much." And I believed her. I still do. That part was real. I have never doubted my mother's love for me, only her attention. I kissed my father. I waved to Marcus's cousins. I smiled in 4 different directions and collected my bouquet from the table where someone had carefully placed it, and I walked out of that barn on my husband's arm. I got into the car with Marcus, and then, once we were on the interstate, and the venue was behind us, and the road stretched out dark and quiet ahead of us, Marcus put his hand on my knee, and I said, "Don't say anything yet." He took his hand back. He drove. I pressed my forehead against the cold window. I watched the Nashville skyline approach and then slide past. I thought about the ceremony, about my father's whisper, about Marcus crying, about the vows, about that song I hadn't heard before. I held those things carefully, like you hold something fragile you're afraid to put down, and then I let myself feel the other thing. It was not just anger, it was grief. This deep, old, exhausted grief that I'd been carrying for such a long time that it had almost become part of my posture. The grief of always being the one who comes second. Of always having something important interrupted by whatever Danielle needed the room to focus on. Of giving her the most sacred role in the most important day I would ever have. Out of love and hope, and the stubborn belief that people can be different than they've always been, and having her use that role to remind me one more time in front of everyone I love, that she will always, always take the light. I thought about all 147 faces swiveling toward her. I thought about my mother's sobs. I thought about the photograph. Danielle's hand on her stomach. The room in soft focus around her. A perfect portrait of a woman being celebrated, taken at my wedding, in my barn, on my night. I pressed my forehead harder against the glass. Marcus, who is the best man I know, waited. He has this quality, a stillness that I have never been able to fully articulate. He doesn't rush into silence. He doesn't fill it with noise because silence makes him uncomfortable. He just waits, and lets whatever needs to happen happen, and then when the moment is right he says the precise thing. When I finally lifted my head from the window, he said very gently, "She did that on purpose, didn't she?" It wasn't a question. I said she knew she was pregnant before the wedding. She had to have. You don't just find out that morning. She's been pregnant for at least 8 or 9 weeks. You can't hide that from yourself, and you certainly don't announce it to 150 people on your sister's wedding night without having thought about it first. "I know," he said. We drove in silence for a while. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "I don't know yet." That was the honest truth. And I want to be precise about that, because everything I eventually did came out of that honest uncertainty, not out of a snap decision made in hurt and anger on my wedding night. I genuinely did not know yet what I was going to do. I knew something had shifted. I knew I could not simply absorb this, the way I had absorbed so many things before it. But the shape of what came next, I didn't have that yet. That came later. We went on our honeymoon, a week in Costa Rica, which Marcus had planned entirely himself, and which was genuinely, blessedly beautiful. I tried to let myself be there. Some of the time I succeeded, but the wedding sat in me like a stone. I kept replaying it. The hand on the stomach, the room turning, my mother's sobs. I came home with something hardened in me. Not rage, something more crystalline than rage, something that felt like decision. When I called my mother to check in, she spent 11 minutes of a 14-minute phone call talking about Danielle's pregnancy, the nursery ideas, the gender reveal she was already planning. How wonderful it was that the announcement had happened at such a special family moment. A special family moment. My wedding. I said, "Mom, do you realize what Danielle did?" My mother paused, and then she said, in this very measured, very careful voice, "Claire, I know you're still processing, and your feelings are valid, but your sister was just so excited she couldn't wait, and you wouldn't want her to have to hide something this joyful." I hung up. Gently. But I hung up. Now here is where the story turns. Because everything I've told you so far, the favoritism, the wedding, the stomach, the room turning, that would be painful enough. That would be enough to post about online and have strangers validate my anger and move on. But 14 days after I came home from my honeymoon, I found out something that changed the entire shape of the story. I should give you some context first. My boss at Aldrich & Vance was a man named Richard Ellison. He was 53, married, the founding partner of the firm, and the single most strategically undermining person I had ever worked for. I want to be careful how I describe him because the word undermining doesn't quite capture it. He wasn't mean, he wasn't openly hostile. What he was subtle. He was the kind of man who takes credit in rooms you're not in, who listens to your ideas in a one-on-one, and then presents them at the all-hands as his own thinking, who smiles warmly at you in the hallway, and then gives the promotion you'd been working toward for 3 years to someone else, and when you ask why, he talks about fit, and timing and patience in a way that leaves you with nothing to push back against. I had been at Aldrich & Vance for 6 years. I was good at my job, genuinely good, not just I think I'm good. Client retention on my accounts was 94%. I had brought in 2 major contracts in the last 18 months. I had trained half the junior team. And Richard had been quietly, consistently making sure that none of that translated into actual advancement. Not because he was threatened by me. Men like Richard are too smooth for something as simple as that. He did it because I was useful exactly where I was, and Richard always prioritized his own convenience over other people's growth. I had started to suspect this, but suspecting and knowing are very different things, and I couldn't afford to be wrong. What I did not know, what I had absolutely no reason to know, was that Richard Ellison had been having an affair with my sister Danielle for approximately 8 months. I found this out the way you find out things you were never supposed to know. By accident. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was leaving a coffee shop near the office, the kind of errand that takes 20 minutes and that nobody notices you're gone for. And I was cutting through the parking structure on the 2nd level when I saw them. Danielle's car, her white SUV, the one with the custom license plate frame that says bad at parallel parking, great at everything else, which is such a Danielle thing to have on a car that I would recognize it from 100 yards, was parked facing the wall. And leaning against the driver's side door close enough that their postures were unmistakable, was Richard Ellison. I stopped walking. My brain did that thing where it refuses a piece of information for about 3 full seconds, just rejects it. Like a bad card at a slot machine. Then it clicked. I stood very still behind a concrete pillar and I watched my sister laugh at something Richard said. I watched him touch her face. I watched her catch his hand and hold it. And I watched the way they stood together with the particular ease of people who have been meeting in parking structures for a long time. I walked back to the office. I sat at my desk. I stared at my screen. And I thought, the baby. Danielle was 3 months pregnant, by her own announcement at my wedding. 8 months of an affair. A husband, Brett. Mild, passive, adoring Brett, who had no idea, and a baby whose father might not be the man sleeping next to her every night. I need to be honest about what happened in my head in the next 48 hours. Because it wasn't clean. It wasn't immediately righteous. It was messy and complicated, and I kept interrogating my own motives. Was I doing this out of genuine concern for Brett? Was I doing it to get back at Danielle for the wedding? Was I doing it because of Richard and what he'd done to my career? Was I doing it because I was finally, after 31 years, just tired? The answer, I think, was all of it, and also none of it. And also at the center of all of it, the simple, inescapable fact that Brett was being deceived by his wife, and that my workplace was being poisoned by a man who had something significant to hide, and that the truth tends to come out eventually, and that the only question was whether it came out in a way that protected the people who needed protecting, or in a way that didn't. I chose to be the way. I did not act impulsively. I want to make this absolutely clear because I know how this kind of story can look, like a woman scorched by her wedding humiliation going nuclear out of spite. That's not what this was. What this was careful. I spent 2 weeks gathering information. Not in a creepy way, not hacking or stalking or anything like that. In a very boring, methodical way. I paid attention. I remembered that Richard had expensed several client dinners in the past 8 months to accounts I managed. Accounts where the client contact would have no reason to authorize a dinner without my knowledge. I pulled the expense reports which I had access to as a senior account manager, and I cross-referenced the dates. Several of those dinner dates corresponded to evenings where Danielle had texted me, "Can't make it tonight, things are crazy," in response to plans we'd made. I took screenshots. I also had a conversation with Jana, very carefully. I did not tell her everything. I told her enough to ask whether she had ever noticed anything unusual about Richard's schedule or his personal calls. Jana, who had worked at Aldrich and Vance for 9 years, and had her own complicated feelings about Richard's management style, looked at me for a long moment and then said, "Why are you asking me that?" And I said, "Because I need to know if I'm not imagining something." She was quiet for a moment. Then she pulled up her phone and showed me a photo she'd taken, months earlier, of Richard leaving the building with a woman she didn't recognize. She hadn't known the woman's name, she hadn't known why it felt significant enough to photograph, but she'd kept it. The woman was Danielle. I thanked Jana. I asked her to keep the conversation between us. She said she would. And then she said, "Whatever you're planning, be careful." I was careful. Here is what I also discovered during those 2 weeks, which is the piece of this that still makes me feel sick in a way that the rest of it doesn't. Richard had been delaying my promotion because he was afraid I was getting too senior, too much access, too much knowledge of the firm's internal operations, not because I was incompetent, because I was becoming difficult to control, and a man who is conducting an affair with an outsider, using company expenses to fund it, and quietly rerouting his personal schedule through business meetings. That man needs the people closest to his operations to be people he can manage. I was no longer manageable in his estimation, so for 3 years he had been making sure I stayed still. When I understood this fully, completely, with the expense reports in front of me and Jana's photo on my phone and 2 weeks of quiet attention paid, something happened to my anger. It didn't get bigger. It got very, very cold. I called Brett. "I want to walk you through this carefully, because it's the hardest thing I did and I've second-guessed it more than anything else. Brett is not a villain in this story. Brett is a man who loved a woman who didn't deserve what he gave her, and he deserved to know." I called him on a Sunday afternoon. I asked if we could meet for coffee. "Just the two of us," I said. I said I needed to talk to him about something important. He agreed, though I could tell he was confused. Brett and I had always been cordial but not close. He was Danielle's husband. I saw him at family events. I liked him fine, but we had no independent relationship. We met at a diner near his house. He arrived before me and was already in a booth, and when I sat down across from him he looked nervous. Like he already knew on some animal level that whatever I was about to say was going to change the shape of his life. I did not show him the photos first. I talked to him first. I asked him gently, as gently as I knew how, about the pregnancy, about how he and Danielle were doing, about whether things had been good between them. He said they were fine. He said he was excited about the baby. He said Danielle had been different lately, more distant, sometimes, but he figured it was hormones and stress and the physical exhaustion of the first trimester. I took a breath. And then I told him. Not everything at once. I told him I had seen something that worried me, and that I didn't know how to carry it without being honest with him. I told him that I had seen Danielle with a man, not just in a way that could be explained innocently. I told him I had reason to believe it had been going on for a significant amount of time. And I told him that given the timing of the pregnancy, he deserved to have that information so he could make his own decisions. He didn't say anything for a long time. He stared at the table. Then he said, "Who?" I told him Richard's name. I showed him the photo Jana had taken. I showed him the cross-referenced expense dates. He sat with it for a while. His jaw worked. His eyes went very bright and then very flat. Then he said, "Does Danielle know you know?" I said no. He said, "I need a few days." I said, "Take whatever you need. But Brett, you should know that I'm going to have to address the work situation regardless. There are financial improprieties connected to this that I can't ignore." He looked at me. He said, "Do what you need to do." I nodded. I paid for the coffees. I walked to my car and sat in it for a long time before I could drive. I reported the expense fraud to the firm's HR and compliance director, a woman named Patricia Wynne, who had a reputation for being thorough and humorless and completely impervious to Richard's particular brand of charm. I did not lead with the affair. I led with the financial documentation, the misdirected expenses, the false client billing, the paper trail I had assembled over 2 patient weeks. I had printed everything and organized it into a folder with labeled tabs, color-coded, chronological, cross-referenced. Patricia was the kind of woman who would respect that, and I needed her to take me seriously from the first 30 seconds. She did. She took the folder, she opened it, she read through the first 2 sections in silence while I sat across from her desk with my hands in my lap and my heart going at approximately twice its normal rate. Patricia Wynne does not perform emotions at work. She does not raise her eyebrows. She does not react. She simply reads and processes and then speaks precisely. She said, "How long have you been aware of this?" I said, "Long enough to make sure I wasn't wrong." She said, "We'll need to investigate." I said, "I know." She was quiet for a moment. I could see her calculating something behind her eyes, the scope of it, probably. The implications. Richard Ellison was a founding partner. His name was on the letterhead. An investigation like this doesn't announce itself quietly, even when the firm wants it to. Then I said, "I should also tell you that the woman involved in what appears to be a personal relationship with Richard, and whose meetings appear to be what some of these expenses were funding, is my sister. I want you to know that upfront so that there's full transparency about my relationship to this situation. I am not bringing this forward out of personal conflict. But I am telling you the connection exists so that you can factor it in however you see fit." Patricia looked at me for a long moment, a real moment, the kind where someone is deciding something about you. Then she said, very evenly, "Thank you for disclosing that." And then she said, "This took courage. I didn't know what to do with that." I nodded. I thanked her. I walked out of her office and went directly to the bathroom and sat in a stall for about 4 minutes doing nothing except breathing. The investigation began the following Monday. By Wednesday of that week, Brett had confronted Danielle. I know this because my mother called me at 7:15 in the evening, her voice at a pitch I had never heard from her before, something between devastation and fury, and said, "Claire, what did you do?" And I said, "Mom, I need you to listen to me very carefully." She talked over me. She said Danielle was hysterical, that Brett had moved out, that Danielle was saying I had gone to Brett specifically to destroy her marriage out of revenge for the wedding. And I said, "Mom, stop." There was silence. I said, "Danielle has been having an affair with my boss for 8 months. He has been using company money to fund it. She knew she was pregnant before my wedding, and chose my wedding reception to announce it, knowing she was likely carrying a child that isn't Brett's. And you want to talk to me about what I did?" My mother was quiet for a long time. She said quietly, "The baby might not be Brett's?" I said, "She'll need a paternity test to know for sure. But the timeline is what it is." Another long silence. Then my mother said in a voice that sounded very small, "Why didn't she come to me?" And that question, that small heartbroken question, broke something open in me that I hadn't expected. Because my mother wasn't defending Danielle anymore. She was grieving her, the version of Danielle she'd believed in, the favorite daughter who could do no wrong. And she was realizing, maybe for the first time, that that version had never entirely existed. I said, "I don't know, Mom. I really don't know." The investigation at Aldrich and Vance concluded 3 weeks later. Richard Ellison resigned. The word resigned is doing a lot of work in that sentence from what Patricia shared with me, which was not much but was enough. The choice was made for him. The expense fraud was documented. The personal conduct was documented. The firm would handle the financial irregularities internally and choose not to pursue external action, which is the corporate equivalent of walking someone to the door and watching them leave. On the day Richard's resignation was announced internally, my director pulled me aside and told me that the senior account director position, the one that had been quietly not offered to me for 3 years, was going to be formally posted within the month, and that she hoped I would apply. I applied. I got it. I want to sit in that for just a moment. 6 years of being managed into stillness, of having my competence used as a floor for someone else to stand on. And now, because I stopped staying quiet, I had what I had earned 3 years ago. If I'm being honest, the promotion felt good, but it didn't feel like the point. The point had never been the promotion. The paternity test. I'll be brief here because it's not my story to tell in detail. It belongs to Brett, and to Danielle, and to whoever that child will turn out to be. But the test was done, at Brett's insistence, and with Danielle unable to credibly refuse it, given everything that had already come to light. The baby was Richard's. Brett filed for divorce within 2 weeks. Richard's wife, a woman I had met exactly once at a firm holiday party, a quiet woman with gray-streaked hair and a warm handshake, filed her own divorce papers shortly after. Danielle moved back into my parents' house, at 28 years old, pregnant with a child whose father had just lost his job, and whose marriage had just ended, and whose own marriage was disintegrating, and whose family, for the first time in our lives, was not rushing in to tell her that everything was okay, and that they understood, and that she was forgiven. She called me once during this time. It was a short call. She was crying, not performing, actually crying in the low, exhausted way that sounds nothing like the theatrical tears I'd grown up watching her produce for maximum effect. She said, "Claire, I need you to understand I didn't plan for things to go this way." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you going to forgive me for the wedding?" And I thought about it. I really did. I sat with that question and I tried to find the most honest answer I could. I said, "Not today, Danielle. But I don't hate you. I want you to be okay. I want your baby to be okay. But I'm not ready to pretend that what you did, all of it didn't happen." She cried for a while. Then she said, "That's fair." And I thought, yes, it is. Finally, something about the two of us is finally, simply fair. My parents have had a harder time with this than I expected. Not in terms of choosing sides, they haven't, really. They've been there for Danielle in a practical way, which makes sense. She's the one in crisis. She's the one who needs somewhere to live. But something shifted in how they talked to me. About a month after everything imploded, my father came to my house. Just showed up. No warning, which he had never done in my adult life. I opened the door and he looked older than I'd ever noticed he looked. He looked tired. He said, "Can I come in?" I made coffee. We sat at my kitchen table. And my father, my quiet, mild newspaper-reading father, said something I had waited my whole life to hear. He said, "I think we let you down, Claire, your mother and I, not just recently. For a long time. We saw that you were capable. And we let that become an excuse not to look too closely. We thought because you were fine, but we weren't paying attention." I didn't know what to do with my face. I looked down at my coffee cup. He said, "I'm not asking you to have a different wedding. I'm not asking you to have had a different childhood. I just want you to know that I see it now. And I'm sorry." I cried. For the first time in this entire saga, I actually cried. Not the tight, swallowed kind of tears I'd been managing for months, but the big, unguarded kind that I usually don't let anyone see. My father put his hand over mine on the table, and we sat there for a long time. It wasn't a fix. It wasn't compensation for 31 years of learning to need less, so Danielle could have more, but it was real. And I had stopped believing I would ever get anything real from my family, so I held on to it. Marcus and I talked about all of this, obviously. We talk about everything. That's what I love most about the life we've built together. Not the apartment we're saving to buy. Not the plans for the future. Not the combined calendar on our phones, but the fact that I can sit across from him in our small kitchen at 10 o'clock at night and say the thing I'm actually thinking, and he will receive it completely. I told him once, lying in bed a few weeks after everything had settled, "I keep wondering if I should feel guilty about any of it." He said, "Do you?" I thought about it honestly. I said no. And he said, "Then I think you have your answer." I get asked. Sometimes by Jana, by friends who have heard pieces of this, by the few people I've told the whole thing to, whether I think I did the right thing, whether exposing Danielle, going to Brett, filing the HR complaint, all of it, whether the consequence was proportionate, whether a woman at her most vulnerable should have been exposed quite so completely. And I understand the question. I do. I've sat with it on enough sleepless nights that I feel like I've earned the right to answer it honestly. Here is what I've come to. Danielle was not a victim of my choices. Danielle made her choices, many of them over many months, and she made them with full knowledge of who they would hurt. She made the choice to stand at my wedding, microphone in hand, and redirect one of the most important moments of my life toward herself. She made the choice to conduct an affair with my boss for 8 months. She made the choice, knowingly or not, to carry a child whose paternity she had every reason to question. and to say absolutely nothing while a husband who adored her planned a nursery and bought a crib and told his parents they were going to be grandparents. I did not destroy Danielle's marriage. Danielle made the choices that destroyed her marriage. I simply provided the information that allowed the people involved to make their own decisions with the full picture in front of them. Brett deserved the full picture. Richard's wife deserved the full picture. The firm that had been defrauded deserved the full picture. Is that a convenient framing? Maybe. I'm not naive enough to pretend my hands are completely clean here, or that my motivations were purely noble and untouched by the very human desire to stop being the only one in this family who absorbs consequences while everyone else walks away clean. I'm not going to pretend there was no part of me that thought, as I assembled those expense reports on a Tuesday night at my kitchen table, she stood at my wedding and she did that. She knew. She knew everything she was hiding and she still stood at my wedding and made it about herself. But here is the thing I've had to sit with. The uncomfortable, complicated thing, which is that even if my wedding had been perfect, even if Danielle had given the most generous maid of honor speech ever delivered, I would still have seen them in that parking garage. I would still have known what I knew, and I would still have had to decide what to do with it. The wedding was the wound that woke me up, but it wasn't the reason I acted. The reason I acted was Brett. The reason I acted was 6 years of competence quietly erased from a firm's institutional memory by a man who needed me to stay invisible so his private life could keep running. The reason I acted was the simpler, older reason that I have always understood intellectually but struggled to act on. The truth, withheld, doesn't protect anyone. It only protects the person withholding it. I'm done being the one who keeps the peace. I'm done absorbing things quietly on behalf of people who have never once asked whether I was okay. Some things shouldn't be kept peaceful, and some people need to feel the weight of what they've done before they can become the person they're capable of being. I have to believe that's true. Because I'm raising a glass, in my small kitchen in Nashville, with Marcus across from me, to the idea that my sister might, one day, in the hard and glamorous work of rebuilding her life, become someone worth knowing fully. Not the performed version, the real one. I'll wait. I have, as it turns out, gotten very good at being patient. Here is where things are now. 4 months later, Marcus and I are good, more than good. We've laughed together about the honeymoon, about the fact that we got on a plane to Costa Rica 5 days after the worst wedding reception moment I've ever experienced, and somehow that trip was still one of the best weeks of my life. Because he is relentlessly good at reminding me of what's actually real. My job. I started the senior director role 3 weeks ago. It is harder than what I was doing before, and it is more mine than anything I've had at that firm, and I walk into the building now with a different kind of posture than I used to. My parents, we're in a slow, careful process of something that I'm not ready to call repair, but is starting to feel like honesty. We have dinner together sometimes, the 4 of us, me and Marcus and my parents. It's quieter than our family dinners used to be. Nobody's performing. Nobody's managing the temperature of the room. We're just 4 people who love each other, imperfectly and with a lot of complicated history, trying to figure out what it means to be honest with each other at this late stage. Danielle, she's 7 months pregnant now. She's living at my parents' house. She goes to her prenatal appointments. She's not, as far as I know, in contact with Richard anymore. She texted me a photo of the nursery my mother helped her set up. The walls are yellow, which I know was her childhood favorite color, and she wrote, "Just thank you for always being honest, even when I didn't want you to be." I stared at that text for a long time. I didn't know how to respond, so I sent her a yellow heart emoji, which felt ridiculous, but it was the most honest thing I had. She sent one back. I don't know what kind of sisters we'll be to each other going forward. I don't know whether we'll build something new, or whether we'll maintain a careful, loving distance that protects us both. I don't know what kind of mother Danielle will be, or what kind of aunt I'll want to be, or whether this baby who had no part in any of this and deserves all the patience and softness in the world will grow up knowing a version of our family that's more honest than the one I grew up in. What I know is this. I stopped moving quietly through spaces that were supposed to belong to me. I stopped making myself smaller so someone else could feel bigger. I stopped believing that keeping the peace was the same thing as protecting what mattered. My wedding was the most important day of my life, not because it was perfect, but because of what it brought to the surface, because of what it made impossible to ignore. Because standing there in that barn, in that dress, with the string lights above me and the wildflowers outside and Marcus's hand in mine, something in me knew, Clearly, finally, without the usual layer of doubt, that I deserved to take up the space I'd been quietly standing in all my life. And no one was going to make me step back from it again. If you've made it this far, and if any part of this story sounds even a little bit familiar, if you have a Danielle in your family, or a Richard in your workplace, or if you've spent years being the capable one, the quiet one, the one who holds everything together while someone else takes the light, I want to say this directly to you. You are not overreacting. You are not too sensitive. You are not wrong for wanting the room to be yours sometimes. The peace you've been keeping, ask yourself what it's cost you. Ask yourself whether the people you've been protecting with your silence have been protecting you in return. I asked myself those questions, and then I stopped waiting for the answer to change. Claire Harmon, Nashville, Tennessee, posted because someone needed to hear it. And honestly, so did I. If this story resonated with you, if you grew up being the steady one, the overlooked one, the one who quietly held everything together while someone else got the applause, drop a comment below. I read every single one. And if you know someone who needs to hear this today, share it. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply say, I see you. What happened to you was real, and you are allowed to take up space.